Thank you. Alison, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak with you today to provide an introduction to our Feeding Infants and Toddlers and Kids Nutrition and Health study. I'm very happy to be here and welcome all of you to this workshop. So let me orient you first to the Feeding Infants and Toddlers study. The Feeding Infants and Toddlers study, of course, covers our time period from birth up to the age of 4. And then the Kids Nutrition and Health study continues from the age of 4 up to the age of 12 or 13. And we're doing this study in several countries around the world. I'm going to stand a little bit over here so I can see the slides. I'm first going to provide an introduction to our FITS and Kids studies, and then I'm going to talk about several issues that we've identified in doing cross-country analysis and how we've addressed them with our FITS and Kids analysis. And my presentation is going to be followed by 4 case studies from members of our team and our collaborators to talk about FITS and Kids data in China, Mexico, the US, and the Philippines. The FITS study was first started in the United States in 2002, and they did a second study in 2008. And these 2 surveys were used as the model for our continuing program that now extends up to 12 or 13 years old. In 2013, Nestle as a company came out with their Creating Shared Value report, and they made a commitment to build nutrition knowledge, leadership in children through the deep understanding of dietary intakes and lifestyle habits. And the goal was to launch large-scale research projects in at least 10 countries across the globe. You can see from this slide that we're well on our way to making that a reality. We currently have FITS and Kids studies going in the United States and Mexico, in Russia, China, the Philippines, and Australia. We approach this research initiative with a 3-tiered scientific approach, and I'll walk you through each one of our levels. We start with what we call nutrition landscaping, and nutrition landscaping begins either with a literature review or understanding what data currently exists in each country. We look at data briefs or other published online resources, and when we've done a thorough literature review, like one of the ones that we have pictured on the screen with Lisa Fries as a co-author, we can even write the systematic review into its own publication. Our second step after nutrition landscaping is to use existing national survey data where it exists. And there are rich resources of national survey data around the world. What's interesting to me, as we've started this journey on the FITS and Kids research program, is how unutilized some of these data sets are. Many are publicly available, but the resources that are available to really deeply investigate all of the richness of the data that are collected are just not there. And so there's a huge effort to meet specific goals in each country, but then the data sets are available to do other research. And that's what we intend to do with our study. So we do customized analysis to answer specific research questions and focus specifically on age groups of our interest. When data don't exist in national surveys, we can fill the gaps by conducting our own studies. And I'll share a little bit more about all of these in the rest of the presentation. This slide provides the framework for the variables that we're interested in learning about for the child's diet, the child's characteristics, and the parent and home environment. And so focused on the child's diet, we look at nutrient adequacy in food groups, meal patterns, eating location, and complementary feeding. But the child's diet sits within the larger context of the child environment. And this also includes physical activity and sedentary behaviors, such as screen time that was mentioned yesterday. We had sleep mentioned yesterday, so this is also something that we can evaluate. Anthropometrics, the child's height and weight and body mass index, and also eating behaviors like whether or not the child is a picky eater. The child's environment, of course, is within the frame of the household environment, and that gives us an opportunity to look at food assistance program participation or supplemental feeding programs, whether or not the child is in daycare or school, which will have a big impact on the foods that they consume and the timing of their meals. We can look at feeding style and responsive feeding, and we can also look at various parental and household demographics. This slide gives the framework for our research and analysis approach. And so when we look at nutrient intakes, we're specifically focused on the percent that fall below the estimated average requirements for vitamins and minerals. We can also look at nutrient excesses, and these can be children who are consuming above the recommendations for energy or for nutrients of concern like saturated fat, sugars, or sodium in the diet. We look at food groups, and food groups are very interesting, and we'll get into a little bit more description of what those are in the next part of the presentation. But with food group analysis, we're able to look at the percent that are consuming and the changes that occur over age. We can look at food sources of energy and different nutrients in the diet. We also look at eating occasions and meal patterns, such as meal skipping, the number of children that are skipping certain meals in different countries. Skipping breakfast is a problem in certain areas, but skipping lunch is also seen in different age categories. We can also look at the number of children who are consuming snacks and what they're eating during in-between meal occasions and the portion sizes that are consumed. And of course, we look at other lifestyle and behavior factors such as eating practices, activity levels, and sleep. This slide provides an overview of study characteristics by country. And you can see that the data that we have available to us varies quite widely from one country to another, even in terms of the number of participants that are available in each of the surveys, ranging from about 1,400 for the younger children in China up to more than 22,000 for children and adolescents in Russia. The highlighted areas for China fits and for the US fits are the studies where we've collected our own data because they were not available in the national surveys. This slide is a nice segue to show differences and highlight some of the issues that we've had in cross-country analysis when we're looking at these surveys and how we've addressed them. I'm going to put all the issues on the table at the beginning, and then you can follow along as we discuss how we've addressed these different issues with examples from our Fits and Kids study. First of all, there are differences in methodology, both in terms of the number and the timing of recalls, as you could see on the previous slide. Estimating usual nutrient intakes is a statistical technique that we can use to get better estimates of intake in the population, but this technique is inconsistently applied and only possible to do when we have multiple days of intake. We have found that there are country-specific age categories that are used, and these are not consistent from one country to another. And the analyses that are performed in each country meet country-specific goals, but weren't designed for comparability across countries. The food grouping systems differ markedly by country. The food composition tables don't always contain the same number of nutrients, and there are differences in the ways eating occasions are reported, both by meal name and by time. So you might say, then why did we keep going? Well, all of these things can be addressed with a little hard work. This slide is again pointing out the difference in methods by country and the fact that it's not always possible to estimate usual nutrient intakes. When we have only one day of intake, we're not able to do that statistical calculation. And we can see that even in countries where we have multiple days of intake, it might be a challenge, because in the case of the Russian National Survey, they collected 1 day of intake in the fall and 1 day of intake in the spring. And so because we're looking at the the dietary intakes of children as they go through the complementary feeding program and into adolescence, even that difference of spring to fall may put them in a different age category for our analysis. This chart is a little bit hard to see, but I've reprinted the data in the next part here. And what I'm showing is an excerpt from the What We Eat in America study, the N. Haynes Dietary Intake Survey, to show the age categories that are used for the analysis in the United States. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday, and we said that we each grow up thinking that the way that our country does the age categorization is the way that all countries do the age categorizations. And that's actually not true. You can see from this comparison here with Australia, China, Mexico, the US, and Russia, all of which have national survey data, none of which align on the age categories when they report their own data. Another aspect of age categories that's very important to us is illustrated in this slide. We've seen national survey data that report information about eating patterns in children and combine ages of, say, 1 to 4, or birth to 5 years of age. And if we combine all of the information on birth to 5-year-olds, we don't see anything about the transition from an all-milk diet to foods of the family table. And so when we do our analysis in the FITS program, we want to look at specific age categories and how food consumption changes in that very critical period of transition, month by month or in small age bands. And we can see here, this diagram is from one of our publications from last year, looking at food group consumption across the ages from 0 to 3 months all the way up to 47 months of intake. This slide illustrates two different ways of presenting data also from our research. The first one from China categorizes intake based on the urban-rural situation in China. And this is a very important topic and one that Barry Popkin has written extensively about, because the transition from rural to urban is very key in the foods that are available in China and how these are consumed. Whereas in the United States, the urban-rural difference isn't very meaningful, and so for the What We Eat in America and Haynes survey, they look at socioeconomic status as a more important variable. In Mexico, geography is the thing that drives the analysis, and so our studies in Mexico look at the north of the country, which has a different dietary pattern from the south and different yet from Mexico City. And so when we've been engaging with other countries about how will we do the analysis there, we also have to recognize that there are different ways of looking at these factors, and they have to be taken into account in a country-by-country manner. Now let's spend a little time addressing the issue of food grouping systems. So again, as we had with the age group descriptions, each country has their own system. And some of the food grouping systems are fairly robust, and some of them are fairly compressed. So let's take first the example of What We Eat in America, the N. Haynes system. The food grouping system in the US is a tiered system, many of them are, with a major food group code, a subgroup, and even within a subgroup, specific subgroups. And I'm going to give you the example of the milk and dairy category. Well, milk and dairy sits within 14 major food groups in the US What We Eat in America survey. In the milk and dairy category, we have a subgroup for milks, flavored milks, dairy drinks and substitutes, cheese, and yogurt. And then each of these has more specificity if you want to go to another level of analyses. Let's contrast that with China. If we're trying to characterize the number of dairy items that are consumed in China, we have to do a little bit more digging. So there are first not 14, but 6, I think, major food groups in China. But the dairy foods are separated into a category called beverages and a separate category called animal foods. Within the beverage category, there's one called milk beverages that has a number of different attributes that may or may not be actually based on dairy products themselves. And finally, in animal foods, there's a category for milk products and a separate one for milk, cheese, and yogurts. So how can we compare dairy intake in the US and China databases? It's not very straightforward, and we've had to do a lot of recoding. So we worked very carefully with the China CDC and recoded the food groups so that we could do comparative studies. And you can see that now we've created a major food group structure with the China food composition table that includes milk and dairy, has categories for milk, flavored milk, dairy drinks, cheese, and yogurt. And then because most of the, well, virtually all of the milk that's consumed in China is full-fat milk, there was no need for us to have a separate specific subgroup based on the fat level in the milk, but we needed to do that for the yogurt. So you can see how we can adapt the food group systems by recoding so that we can facilitate analysis in the studies. Another example has to do with how mixed dishes are categorized and where we might find soups. So soups are part of mixed dishes in the US structure because they're not regularly consumed and don't play a big part in the diet. But when we looked at the food grouping system for Russia, we saw a completely different situation. Soups are eaten every day and sometimes multiple times a day in the Russian diet. And so they have a category within their milk and dairy food group for milk-based soups or cream-based soups. And then they have a separate food grouping system just for first courses in soups that includes the vegetable-based, meat-based, and fish-based soups. And so it's important for us to understand how the foods are grouped so that we can compare across our countries. Another one of the issues that I mentioned is that the food composition tables differ. And there are some food composition tables in the world, such as the one in Australia or the one in the UK, the United States, that are very comprehensive and have a large number of nutrients and also other food components like whole grain or other characteristics of food, individual fatty acids and so on. But some food composition tables around the world lack even some of the nutrients that are most of concern in the current environment, such as added sugar. And so we used the Fits and Kids study as a way to impute added sugars for China and Mexico so that we could look at added sugar and total sugar consumption in these countries and compare one to another. We can see the data shown here. China's consumption of added and total sugars is very small compared to Mexico, which is even lower than what we see in the United States. The last attribute that I wanted to mention is that meal names and times differ. And I'm going to give an Australian example here, where some work that we did with Flavia Fayette Moore is shown on the left. We plotted the time of day of intake of all the eating occasions during the day. And we did that over time for 3 different national survey periods. And you can see that there has been some difference in eating patterns. But what's interesting, with each of these spikes, we can see a regular pattern of consuming not only a breakfast, but a morning snack, a lunch, an afternoon snack, and dinner. And so the eating pattern there is based on almost 5 food consumption opportunities during a day. The bar chart that you see on the right-hand side of your screen shows energy intake by eating occasion in Mexican children. And what you might notice here is that rather than have a 3-meal pattern of breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we have a 4-meal pattern, and that is breakfast, almuerzo, lunch, and dinner. And what we found through our analysis was that in fact children don't necessarily eat all 4 of those eating occasions. They might have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or they might have almuerzo and lunch and dinner, or they might have breakfast and almuerzo and dinner, but they don't generally have 4 eating occasions. And this differs in the north part of the country and the south part of the country based on cultural habits. So being aware of how people are consuming and when people are consuming food is also important to our overall analysis. Our experience with the Fits in Kids study has led us to several recommendations for conducting dietary intake and lifestyle surveys. The first is to provide comprehensive coverage of 0 to 13-year-olds across the countries. This is still missing in many national surveys. And if we look around the world, some people think that it's impossible to collect dietary intake data from infants and toddlers or even from young children, and may only start their national surveys after the age of 10 or 12 years old. So we would like to advocate for including young children and infants and toddlers in all of the national surveys. We would also recommend to conduct multiple days of 24-hour recalls using established methodology such as multiple pass interviews to reduce the number of missing items in the diets as we capture the dietary intake, and to provide the necessary level of detail on the foods that are consumed. We want 2 non-consecutive days of intake at least so that we can perform the usual nutrient intake estimations. And we want to implement a standardized analysis plan or provide some guidance on an analysis plan so that we can cut down on the amount of recoding of the data that needs to be done. And finally, we would like to advocate for enhancing food composition tables with new foods and nutrients of public health concern so that we can address these consistently across studies in the world. In summary, I'd like to say that the studies that we've done so far in the Fits in Kids program generally use multiple 24-hour recalls, but the number and timing vary. Some national surveys don't collect data on infants and young children, and we need to fill this gap. Different countries use different age and demographic classifications, so customized analyses are necessary. Food grouping schemes also need to be adapted for comparisons, and we've done quite a lot of that in our project. Different approaches to define eating occasions require awareness and understanding when comparing across countries and interpreting the findings that we see. And finally, the databases can be enhanced with imputed nutrient values when they're missing. I have a lot of people to thank that participate in this project around the world, and I've listed some of them here. We have external research partners that you can see listed on the right, but I want to particularly acknowledge our own research team at the Nestle Research Center, one of whom is here with us today, my colleague Dantong Wang, who will present the data on China later today. And 3 research collaborators that we have enjoyed working with to present data on our FITs in the United States, FITs in Mexico, and from the FNRI in the Philippines, Dr. Reagan Bailey, Dr. Villalpando, and Dr. Agdepa. So thank you very much. And my presentation after questions and answers will be followed by these case studies, so you can learn more about the data that we've collected in 4 of the countries from our Fits in Kids study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison, for that very lucid, overarching theme of what the program was. But also, I think it was quite important that you reminded this particular program had 4 centers of foci. One was nutrient intake, also what were the food groups, then the eating occasions and lifestyle and behavior, I think makes it a rather unique program. We have some time, and so I think now the floor is open for any questions from the audience.
Teresa Nicholas from USA. Alison, just as a segue to the next case study in U.S., in terms of breast milk, did you this next go around apply the same formula that you used previously for assessing breast milk, so that will be within the equation for the nutrient values that
Yes.
are presented in the case study?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Could you just clarify, with the food composition databases and the imputation of nutrients, do you consistently use the same food composition database to do the imputation? How do you work that out?
So it depends on the country that we're doing the imputation. For example, in Mexico, they used several sources of data to enhance the food composition tables there. Only about 66% of the foods in the Mexican food composition tables are based on foods from Mexico or neighboring countries, not including the United States. So the other 33% of data came from the US food composition tables. When we've done work to impute values here in the Philippines, the sources of data also come from other regional databases that are available here, because we want to use appropriate databases to the region. And where they're not available, then we go back to the USDA food composition tables. Mm-hmm.
Oh yes, over there.
Hi. You talked about the meal timings and frequency of meals in your study.
Mm-hmm.
So, what would you recommend regarding number of meals which should be given from time of weaning at 6 months to say a 1 to 2 year old? So, like we begin with one time a day to 2 times a day, and how do we increase the frequency and times of meals for small kids?
So you mean during the complementary?
During the day. During the complementary feed.
Well, I think that the frequent small meals are very commonly consumed and recommended for introduction of complementary foods. Little children, babies, have small stomachs and can't take a large amount of food at one time, and so having smaller meals distributed through the day is very important. But as children transition into more foods of the family table and get into a more regular eating pattern after the age of 1 or 2, they need to eat at more regular times, and they don't need to have so much in between meals.
And furthering that, often the new mothers want to know how much food quantity to begin with the babies as a guide. So what is the best way to tell them about?
Well, I'm not sure that that's my area of expertise necessarily, and we can refer to some of our pediatricians in the audience.
Okay.
But truly, small spoonfuls of
Small
tastes is the way to get to first introduce the foods.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we got 2 questions from the floor, Alison.
Okay.
The first one reads, can you make generalization based on a 1-day pass or a 3-day recall? Is there a difference in their validity?
I would say that the nutrition literature would generally support that the mean estimates of a population would be the same, whether you're looking at 1-day population intakes or whether you're looking at 3-day population intakes. But where there are differences are in the distributions of those nutrient intakes. And so what we see if we only look at 1 day is that we tend to overestimate the number of children who are at risk, and we tend to overestimate also the number of children who would be in excess. And what the usual nutrient intake distributions that we can get from multiple days of intake do is bring those tails of distribution in and give us a better estimate of the overall intake of the population.
Thank you. The lady? Yeah.
Just to share the fact that in India, when we do a community-based dietary surveys, not for children of 0 to 13 till date, we usually do a 7-day dietary recall.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure, considering the magnitude of the FITS and kids study, this will have to be worked out, the practicality has to be worked out. But the usual process is we do a 7-day recall.
Mm-hmm. That's a very important comment, and I thank you very much for that. In China, they also did a multiple day dietary, it was recalls, but over the course of 3 consecutive days that usually included 2 weekdays and a weekend day. And the point there was to really understand what is being consumed at the family level, but the unique aspect of the China database was that they also measured some of the household consumption of oils and soy sauce and things that would be difficult for some individual in the family to estimate. And by weighing before and after, then we could apply that information to the whole family. So I think you're pointing out exactly some of the unique characteristics that have to be taken into consideration when we do surveys in different countries.
Okay, another question from the floor. After reviewing the literature, what is your suggestion on a better age grouping to be used for dietary surveys?
Okay, that's a good question. And I think it really depends on how you're going to be using the data and for what purpose. So I want to advocate more for flexibility than to necessarily recommend one specific age category. But an age category that's worked very well for us is for, especially for the infants, to look at 0 up to 4 months of age, which is often the point where complementary foods are beginning to be introduced in tasting portions. Then 4 to 6 months of age, and 6 months to 12. And 6 months to 12 is when they really should be making that transition from 100% breastfeeding or breastfeeding plus tastes to more foods of the family table. We don't see a big change between 12 months and 36 months of age, so that's also fine to look in a broader age band there. And then for the older children, we look at 4 to 8-year-olds usually, and 8 to 13-year-olds, 9 to 13-year-olds.
I have a question, Alison. In the different countries, how were the dietary intake validated?
So in the countries that have done national surveys, they've often validated them by repeating. They've done national surveys in the same way over the course of many years, and so they were validated early in the time period that the survey was implemented. But I don't know that they do validation studies every single time, and Teresa, you could maybe help me with that. I don't believe that NHANES, for example, does a validation study every time they do the survey. They've established their methodology, and now their methodology is what they use for the national survey. So, but they can validate in a number of different ways. Some surveys have validated, when they created the automated multiple pass method in the United States, for example, they validated energy intake estimations by doubly labeled water. And sometimes they validate the 24-hour recalls with other methods of dietary data collection, such as 7-day weighed food records in a smaller subset of people.
There is a question from Ani of Indonesia. What is the inclusion criteria selected in those countries? And what are your purpose comparing between countries? It can be used to with other countries. In other words, you collected data of dietary intake. Would you now compare data for different countries?
Well, I would say that most of the interest in the use of the data are for the country-specific uses. But even doing this in-depth analysis is often more than what's being done by the national survey teams themselves. But we're interested from a research standpoint in how countries differ, because as again, I said we've identified that many countries don't really appreciate that their way of doing things or that their findings are not the same as elsewhere in the world. And the illustration that I had showing the added sugars from China, from Mexico, and the US is a good example of that. We've had people in our company say, sugar is an issue for children all over the world, and you get this expectation that sugar is really a problem everywhere. And in fact, there are very few children who consume added sugar in China. So making a broad statement like that is actually not valid, and we can show that with our study.
Did you encounter any allergies or adverse reactions to introduction of animal proteins between 6 to 12 months of age?
We haven't actually, we haven't looked at allergy reports in the surveys if they've been collected. The national surveys for nutrition and health are generally based on dietary intake data in healthy populations. And so in some cases they may collect information about allergy, but I'm not aware that they've been correlated.
A very small query. To draw this nationally representative sample from different countries, have you used the same sampling strategy or has it differed from country to country?
Most of the countries use a geographical sampling that's based on the census reports, and so they're able to draw a multi-stage nationally representative sample. That hasn't always been the case, and certainly in the studies, the earlier study that we sponsored in China, that wasn't feasible for us. The geography of China was too challenging, and so we decided not to pull a nationally representative sample, but to pull a sample that represented the geography of the major concentration of people in China. So it came from 8 large regions and 3 mega cities.
Another question to the floor, Alison. In this type of studies, what was your basis in choosing these countries?
That's a very interesting question, and one that's not completely answerable by science. So, our company has markets around the world, and some of the decisions about which countries we were going to investigate had to do with our interest in the markets around the world.
One question about the food grouping, Alison. You know that a lot of people get into disaggregation of the different food groups. So you dissect the Mexican dishes because you get a much more accurate representation on how much dairy products they are consuming relative to the dietary recommendations.
Yep.
And so some people are actually going to show the data both ways. The disaggregated data. It depends upon the purpose of presenting the food groups. If it has to do with nutrition policy and the dietary guidelines, then disaggregation seems the way to go.
That's a very important point, and it's actually a point that we've had a lot of discussions about for the younger children data. In the United States now, they're creating a lot of baby food products that are mixtures. And so they might be applesauce based, but also have carrots, or they might be carrot based, but also have sweet potato. And so, how do you disaggregate? And disaggregation can be very difficult because there's nothing on the label that tells you that this product contains X servings of vegetables and X servings of fruits. And what we found in Mexico is that if you look at the servings of fruits and vegetables that are consumed outside of mixed dishes, you get a very low estimate of fruit and vegetable intake because so many fruits and vegetables in particular are consumed as part of mixed dishes in Mexico. There's hardly a tortilla-type dish that doesn't include beans or tomatoes or some other kind of vegetables. And so if you just look at the servings of vegetables as consumed, you really underestimate the total vegetable intake. Yeah.
Any further questions? Right of me? Middle of me? Left of me? Oh, rest left.
For children in the complementary feeding age, did you consider the food grouping of the WHO, which is just limited to 7 food groups?
No, we didn't. We're interested in a little bit broader perspective on the foods that are consumed by babies, and so we tend to recode the data to have a more comprehensive view on all the food groups. And for example, I'll give an example from Mexico. We're interested not only in fruit consumption, but also in 100% fruit juice consumption. And so if we don't have a group that recognizes the 100% fruit juice as different from, say, a fruit drink or a drink that contains a little bit of fruit juice but much more added sugar, we can't really see the pattern of intake the way that we want to. So we do recode for more specificity. We've done a lot of recoding for other attributes as well. So I'm not sure if Reagan is going to mention this in her presentation in a little while, but we recoded all of the foods that were consumed by infants and toddlers in the US to estimate whole grain servings as well, because it was missing from the food composition table that we had, and we had reasonable estimates of the whole grain content of different foods that were eaten in the diet. So in this way, we can really enhance the data that are available in a country and make it more interesting from a research standpoint and from a public health standpoint.
Yeah, I have a question, Alison. What is the impact of the results of the study, the FITS study, in terms of policy or in terms of nutrition education? Could you please?
So Nestle Nutrition has a program they call Start Healthy, Stay Healthy, and it provides educational guidance to parents about eating and feeding behaviors during this complementary and early toddler feeding period. Data from the FIT study in the US have been used extensively to support the Start Healthy, Stay Healthy recommendations for complementary feeding. But in terms of policy, I think we have an opportunity that's much more important. And I'll give an example of Mexico, and I'm sure Salvador will be talking about this later. He was involved in a consensus panel on introduction of appropriate beverages and complementary foods for children in Mexico. And data from our study, as well as other data from the Ensenut study, were used to inform that policy guidance document. So that's, to me, a very good example of a use of our data.
Any further questions? Well, in that case, Alison, many thanks for your presentation, but also for fielding a variety of interesting questions. So in the interest of time, we're going to press on.